My name is Alan. I'm the Chief Economist from Apin Huang Capital. In fact, there are 3 sessions running concurrently, and I'm glad that you all decided to choose this session. I'm sure you all will benefit from the discussion from Mr. Alan and also Dr. Shankaran. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Shankaran to present your paper.
Thank you. Thank you so much for choosing this breakout session over the others. I hope you don't regret it, but let me see what I can do to inform you on the state of the economy. A lot of the time when I'm preparing a presentation, I perhaps spend more time worrying about whether the colors are right, the font size is right, and sometimes the content gets overlooked. Very likely it's happened again this time, and that's why you have the Q&A session, to remind me that I forgot something or the other, and that the next time I do a presentation I'll include it. But it's very likely the next time too I'd forget. But anyway, I thought I'd look at 2 things. I thought I'd look at industrialization, and I thought I'd look at this new slogan that has been launched, shared prosperity. And I thought perhaps we could look at both these things and see if there is something in it for the nation. We are very familiar with the role industrialization has played in the country's history. A lot of it is an ongoing story. It's something that's been happening since the 60s. And in the 60s, there were a lot of efforts that were taken to push up industrialization. At that point, we had some advantages that we don't have today. We were very much sought after. We were one of the few countries that had cheap, manageable labor, relatively a lot that could be offered by way of labor in terms of its quality that wasn't available elsewhere. And you had a whole set of incentives that were being made available, and that was the time when the Japanese too were looking around for a place where they could set up their factories, etc., and we were very convenient. So industrialization has sort of a history of that sort. And having a low start, I think in the progress was pretty rapid in the late 60s. And as you can see, I mean, the growth figures, the GDP figures, pretty impressive in the 70s, 80s, and perhaps they reached their peak just before the 97-98 crisis. Subsequently, we see a fall in the GDP. A whole host of factors, how the rest of the world has been doing, how the region has been doing, and specifically how Malaysia within the region has been performing. My sense is that things are getting, perhaps going to get much tighter. And as you can see, in the 70s, growth rate was touched 10%. And more recently, it's been shrinking, slightly above 5. Probably would be 4.7 or so this year. And in the years to come, one wouldn't be surprised if it came down to 4.3, 4. And what happens subsequently, the next 10 years or so, would not entirely be dictated by what happens within Malaysia, but what happens within the region. We have stiff competition coming up from Vietnam, from Indonesia, and the same kind of points on which we could attract investment ceased to be so now. If you drill a bit further down, you find that the blue line, they're all in blue. You see that services, that's this one. Okay, that seems to be a big source of employment, less so for manufacturing. It seems to be going down, which is not a very good thing, or perhaps it's not a very good thing. Agriculture, of course, ceases to be a big contributor to GDP, not a big contributor to employment. But perhaps the worrying thing is the decline in manufacturing as a source, as a generator of employment. What can we say about labor productivity? Not spectacular either. Looking at some of the subsectors, you see that labor productivity has not been increasing rapidly. And the way labor productivity was calculated here was by looking at value added and dividing it by total employment. So what you have is how much value added is contributed by each person employed. This is deceptive because it makes it appear as if the E&E sector has seen a downturn in productivity in the way that I've mentioned it being calculated, only to see a huge spike. The deceptive element here is in value added, and the sleight of hand here is that your total value added is equal to the value added generated by 1 unit multiplied by the volume. And the case with the E&E sector is, although the value added per unit produced is low, there is sufficient volume to compensate for it, and consequently the total value added that is generated is big. Divide that by employment and you find the number going up. And why did it go up in 2017 or in that period, in the period 2010-2017? It went up because there was an upswing in the demand for E&E. So exports for this sector did extremely well, and the volume masked the low value added that is typical of the E&E sector. Nothing much has changed with the E&E sector. We're not engaged in the high-tech part of the industry, I mean globally. For chemicals, again, the productivity is less impressive than it was in the 1995, 2000, 2005 period. It's worse with petroleum and coal. Productivity has been sinking. It's been contracting. It's in negative territory in recent years. Same is the case with machinery. And so you have two unhappy bits of data so far. You find that your GDP is not doing very well. It's not doing as well as it used to do. You see that the manufacturing sector is not a big generator of employment. Go down one step and you find that the productivity of your employment has also been slipping. In terms of trade as a percentage of GDP, that seems to have done well in the late 1990s, but it has been decreasing in recent years. And remember that a lot of our trade is export-oriented. Obviously, if it's trade, it has to be export-oriented. Okay, but a lot of it comes from the manufacturing sector, especially from the E&E sector, which I think accounts for something like 30% of your exports. So, quite obviously, something has got to be done to reverse this downturn. You'd like to see another period where you would have the same upward sloping curve. So looks like you need something to trigger the upward movement. In terms of the composition of your total exports, it's top of the scale is machinery, and your a lot of the other manufactured goods are sort of stuck down here. Okay, chemicals is doing better than the rest of the bunch. Now, how much of the phenomenon that we're looking at is particular to Malaysia? What we have, by which I mean that if you looked at the value added, you find that as a percentage of GDP, there is a downtrend. But if you looked at it in terms of its value, not in terms of its share, but in terms of its value, in terms of dollars and cents, then obviously that's a good picture. But if you looked at it as a share of GDP, it's declining. And that seems to be very much the case with a lot of the ASEAN countries. Some are doing better than others. Thailand, for instance, is doing better than Malaysia is. And recently, over the last 5 years or so, you find that Vietnam seems to be sort of creeping upwards. So a couple of questions, therefore, come to mind. Quite obviously, there is a need to reinvigorate industry. There is a need to relook the way in which industrialization is proceeding in Malaysia. There is, of course, the argument that Malaysia should compare itself with developed countries. And in developed countries, services accounts for something like 70%. We're not there yet. We are at about 57, 58%. So really, we should be, the argument is therefore that we should be concentrating on services, that there's a lot more that should be done in terms of services, and that we should look at ways in which we should be exporting products from the services sector. I don't have the figures for the services sector, but I've looked at them, and I don't think there's a lot that we could export, that we are exporting from the services sector. A lot of it is for domestic consumption. A lot of it is internally for internal use. Finance, for instance, is at a pretty low level, and it has actually been decreasing. So we can't yet think of being a hub for financial services. We have we are very much a part of global value chains. Now, the tricky thing about global value chains is that you can be a part of the party, but you need not be a big player in that party. You could be, I don't know, something like a wallflower. You're there, you maybe passing the drinks around and things like that, but you're not the heart and the life of the party. And I think that's a little bit the case with global value chains, or Malaysia's position in the global value chains. As I was telling you just now, value added that is being generated is quite often masked by the volume. And the case with Malaysia is that there's a lot of value added that is being generated. But if you looked at a lot of these, of the products that find themselves being produced in Malaysia, prime example being E&E industry, the value added generated within the E&E industry is very small. The biggest would be value added would come from palm oil. So now the point is, I'm not suggesting that we should turn to palm oil and not and forget about the E&E sector. Rather, what I would propose is that you need to have high-skilled technology, and you have to generate a lot of value added. So you need these two components if you're going to drive the economy ahead. There is, of course, a role for the services sector. And what role does the services sector have? You need to have a solid services sector in order to promote the advancement of industrialization. That's where the services sector comes in, or I think would come in the Malaysian case. And along with that, there I think is an urgent need to revisit industrial policy in this country. So these are some of the things that we need to look at. We need to look at high-skill, high-technology industries. We need to look at revisit industrial policy, and we need to look at the new drivers in industrialization. What are the new drivers that are going to drive our industry? This is a sampling of the kinds of industries that we could look at. I'm not suggesting that this is final, but these are probably areas, and areas such as this could be investigated. We could look at, for instance, developing the hydrogen economy, which is important in changing the direction of the supply of energy in this country. We could also look at the automobile industry, but from a slightly different perspective. We could perhaps look at palm oil as a source of fuel. So these are possible, these are suggestive. And by no means am I not telling you that this is the way the government or the country should go ahead. You need to look at things like, is this viable within the Malaysian case? Do we have a market? Would there be sufficient volume that could be exported? Do we have the technical expertise? And so on and so forth. And I think this kind of due diligence was perhaps not done with Proton, and it would be disastrous to take that path again. Now, industrialization would need the support of, as I mentioned, the services sector. So you do need a solid, a strong logistics sector, finance, postal and courier, advertising, and so on and so forth. You also need to relook education and go beyond black and white shoes. And you need to look at the fiscal incentives that can be offered. But then again, there are limits to the kind of fiscal incentives that can be offered. My sense, talking to people in the government agencies, is that perhaps we've reached the limits of trying to attract investment entirely on the basis of fiscal incentives. So we need to relook the kinds of packages that we can give. Because if you worked entirely on fiscal incentives, as so often happens, foreign investors, they come, they talk to the guys at MIDA, they get a set of incentives that MIDA is willing to give, then they cross the causeway with that package, they negotiate a better deal, and they don't come back again. So we can't work entirely on the basis of fiscal incentives. And as far as the global value chains are concerned, we seem to be caught in that segment of global value chains which are engaged in low value added processes. And we need to move up the ladder. Can take a number of ways. Upgrading the processes that are employed, working on a different set of products which are more upstream, functional upgrading, or applying skills, expertise that we have obtained from one sector and applying it to some other sector where the competence and expertise is valuable. We have a phenomenon of deindustrialization. We could ignore it, and we could look at the services sector, or we could take another look at industrialization and see how it can contribute to this right now rather amorphous vision of shared prosperity 2030. 2030 has some of the ingredients of the things that I've been talking about. It talks about AI, it talks about Industry 4.0, it looks at new drivers of growth, but it doesn't tell you how all of that can be put together. I've sort of given you a hint how it could be put together, but if you want a more detailed document, you'll have to see my chairman. Thank you.
I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about three things. One, a diagnosis of where we are now. I think this share a lot of similarity with what Dr. Shankaran has just shared with you. Two, I would argue that we need to urgently rethink the industrial strategy that we currently have. And lastly, how does the financial system fit into all this, right? Typically, when we talk about industrial development, industrial strategy, financial system doesn't quite come in. So I'll try to tie that in based on what we know in the literature. Okay, first off, diagnosis. So Malaysia has reached peak manufacturing in year 2000, right? Depending on how you look at it, either value added or by employment share, we reached it about like end 1990s or early 2000. And here what we have tried to do is actually to break down when you deindustrialize, i.e. the share of your manufacturing relative to the entire economy, which part of manufacturing is actually shrinking. So we break it down into three segments: high-tech manufacturing, mid-tech, and low-tech. This is based on R&D intensity, right? So what has been declining is actually the high-tech part, right? That is the part of the manufacturing that has been shrinking. Important to note that it has shrunk since 2000, but it has remained like relatively flat since the global financial crisis. The other sectors have actually not. The share remained relatively flat, right? The mid-tech and the low-tech segment. So the thing that is actually hollowing out within our manufacturing sector is actually the high-tech sector. These are your E&Es, your optical products, medical devices, and so on. So, and then the second thing that we should notice is that the structural change that has been accompanying this decline in manufacturing is actually the growth of services. Again, we did the same thing. We try to break down services into three types of services: modern services. This is your finance, insurance, real estate, business services, professional services, R&D, and the likes. More typical kind of a medium tech kind of services: transportation, storage, communication, including your ICT. And then the last one is more traditional services: your retail, your wholesale, accommodation, and so on. So what we have seen is that the decline in manufacturing has been accompanied by not an increase in the high value added services, which is a very faint orange line that you couldn't see, but it's declining, right? I think Dr. Shankaran also mentioned just now that finance, for example, is as a share of the economy is actually shrinking. Mid-tech is slowly rising, but not much. But the real change comes from the traditional services sector, the lower value added sector of the economy. So this is what we have. We reached peak industry in 2000. 2000 is an important year, right? Globally, it marks a very significant change in the way global production network changed through the entrance of China, and that was also coinciding with when most countries, emerging economies, actually began to deindustrialize before they get rich. Typically, in the past, in the 70s and so on, most economies actually become rich first before they industrialize, or that coincided with them actually transitioning to become a developed economy. Most emerging economies didn't actually experience this in this more recent period, since 2000. And another point to highlight is that in the developed economies, for example, what happened is that when you deindustrialize, your resources, your employment, your capital actually move to higher value added services sector, right? So services is an important driver of productivity and so on. That didn't quite happen with us. We actually revert back to more traditional kind of services. So that's what's happening to the Malaysian economy on a structural perspective from the major sectors. We can look at it further. We can look at it within sectors itself. And what we see, these are actually dots of each of the main subsectors within manufacturing, services, and the other major subsector of the economy. And what we have seen is that since this is the latest, this is as far as we can go back based on those statistics. But since 2010 to 2016, what we have seen is that for within each sector, now just now I shown you movement across sector. Now this is within each sector. Sectors have become more labor intensive, relying more on foreign workers, and less capital intensive, relying less on investment in intensive equipment. This is what this chart is showing. And this, of course, has been this has accompanied this stepwise decline in our productivity over the years. This is before the Asian financial crisis, this is before the global financial crisis, and this is now. Right. So we are going through the industrialization. Our firms are actually using factor of production which are more labor intensive rather than capital intensive, and our productivity is declining. So there are more. I can share more if you're interested, and if you want to ask more questions about how we look at things. We also look at actually how this structural change has been accompanied by significant growth in smaller firms, much smaller firms, which are highly less productive than the bigger firms. And in fact, we have seen absolute decline in larger firms in contributing to the economy. Again, this is part of the same story. Traditional retail services are most of them smaller in nature compared to, say, large scale manufacturing. So with this, I argue that we need to urgently rethink the way we look at industrial strategy. So it's important to appreciate that the fundamental unit of activity within this context is actually the firm, right? The Malaysian firm. And if we look at how the firms in Malaysia have transformed over the year, this is highly stylized, okay? So, but I think to help to narrate that story is that prior to the 70s, very resource based. We export, yes. We also produce locally, but we depend a lot on our natural endowment. But in the 70s and until the early 80s, we embark on more capital intensive manufacturing. But it was mainly from an import substitution perspective, right? We produce for our own demand. But mid 80s to the late 90s, this was the time when our growth rate was close to 9 to 10% GDP per capita in real term annually, right? So this was when we embarked on export-oriented industrialization. With the 86 was the magical year for us when we put in place the Promotion of Investment Act at the same time that the Plaza Accord happened. So everything was aligned, and then we industrialized very rapidly. Interesting to know also, the mid 80s was also a time in which the workforce became more, there are more people who are in secondary education than primary education. So everything was aligned in the mid 80s, and we began to industrialize very rapidly, producing producing goods for the external demand for other countries, right? And this we rely a lot on FDI promotions, and then from there on firms that are supporting the FDIs and so on and so forth. Now, this is the important point. For the next phase of development, the point I want to argue is that we can't continue to do what worked in the mid 80s and up to the late 90s, right? Because then we were moving from middle income to upper middle income. Right now, if we are to transition ourselves to be a higher value added, high income economy, then we have to rethink what we need to do, right? If we continue to embark on the same set of strategy, it's unlikely that it will bring us there. So South Korea, Japan didn't continue to export within their own country. They also did other things. They did that, right? But they also did other things. They innovated. They became the FDI themselves, right? They moved to other countries, and then they built supply chain as the head of the supply chain, controlling the supply chain itself, right? Have our Malaysian firms done that since reaching peak industrialization, right? I think that's the question that we should ask ourselves. So I think the key thing to understand is that, do we want to attract FDI and promote more export-oriented activity within the country? I think the answer is yes. I think those are important set of activities. Export, FDI provides spillover in terms of knowledge, in terms of technological transfer and so on and so forth. But that is not enough, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to bring us to the next level. The question is, can we actually engineer reverse FDI, i.e. our firms go abroad to leverage on cost competitiveness in other countries, in the region perhaps, and then be major manufacturing powerhouses, right? Do we have our own homegrown international firms? Do we have our own version of Huawei, our own version of Samsung? We don't, right? So I think the next phase for us to embark into be a more developed country is actually for us to reach there. So look at our own firms. How do we make them more international, more globally competitive, and for them to drive economic activities? So plugging ourselves into GVCs are all good and fine, but if we do not dictate the movement of the GVC, there's only so much we can grow. Yeah, there's an effort required. Just highlight some of the key things that we have learned from the literature of what is necessary. I think the key takeaway from this slide is the fact that we need to rethink industrial strategy, right? It's not just about attracting FDIs, it's not just about promoting export, it's beyond that. So I think the MTI of Singapore is a good example, and it's not that we should always learn from the Singaporean, but I think it provides a good example. I think we know under MTI there's the EDB, right, which is equivalent to our MIDA, i.e. Promote getting FDI into the country and so on. But they have also, I think, consolidated a lot of resources and put a lot of effort in another entity, which is Enterprise Singapore, which is basically our Matrade, but in a way that is, the purpose is actually to bring Singaporean businesses to other countries to internationalize the Singaporean businesses. So I think we need similar kind of focus to be our own champions. Right. So what do we know about financial system and industrial development? I think we are fairly confident based on the researchers, based on literature, that financial development is actually essential when it comes to economic development itself, right? Not growth per se, but structural upgrading of the economy, right? Here I'm just trying to summarize a very vast field of literature on this issue. The key point is this: financial development is a source of comparative advantage. What does it do, right? Finance does three very important things. One is that it intermediates savings to productive capital, right, to investment. Two, it allocates resources more efficiently through market-based signal. And three, it manages risk, right? So all these are necessary as the economy becomes more complex and more developed. And financial constraints often restrict firms from actually embarking to embark on investment that is more capital intensive, higher value added, and so on. And these are not just theory; these are empirically shown in the vast literature in both developing countries and developed economies. But one thing we should recognize is that financial system is not one thing, right? It's actually very heterogeneous. At the very basic level, to recognize the differences that the banking system and the capital market play. Banks typically, in a very stylized manner, are more optimized at providing more standardized kind of financing, collateralized and lower risk, whereas security markets are better at financing more innovative, higher risk kind of activity. So as the economy transform and transition to become more developed, I think the financial sector also play a very key role, especially when it comes to financing sectors which are at the frontier of the economy. So there's a lot about this in Malaysia that I think we can, first off, try to understand better and also try to change. This chart here is actually not from me. I just reproduced this chart from Bank Negara, their latest financial stability and payment system report. They did a survey on SMEs and asked them what is the rejection rate. It's a box article in the latest report. You should read the entire thing. I'm just taking one of the charts, the survey results. They asked they try to ask the question of the rejection rate of SME across different type of SMEs. So the average rejection rate is about 9%, right? This is 9%, but it differs across the type of SMEs. Now you have construction and services, presumably lower value added. They are either average or slightly lower than the overall rejection rate. But when we see automating SMEs, exporters, innovating SME, manufacturing, they get much higher rejection rate, which is understandable given the nature of the banking system. The question is, are our SMEs and our firms in general credit ration, financially constrained? I think if you are interested in this, if you are doing research on this, and if you are interested in this, there are multiple sources of information that can actually ascertain that whether this is true or not in the broader economy, not just amongst SME. For example, just to share with you, since 2012, so the World Economic Forum publishes the Global Competitiveness Report. right? And they within that report they actually asked the question: what are the top 10 constraint burdens that you have when it comes to doing business? They asked the survey CEOs and they rank the categories of constraint that they have. Since 2012, access to financing has been one of the top 3 biggest problem. The other 2 interchangeably is the foreign exchange administration and as well as inflation or corruption. It moves up and down, right? So that is a good and interesting source of information on whether our firms are actually financially constrained. Another one is actually from the enterprise survey by the World Bank. This is micro level data, very interesting. You can actually look at it in terms of financial constraint of the firms, whether they have access to loans and so on and so forth. And if you compare us to the regional peers as well as upper middle income economies and higher income economies, we are actually more. So they have categories called partially financially constrained and fully financially constrained firms. Our percentage in those 2 categories are much higher than comparators, right? So these are interesting points that we should look into closely. So this is summary slide. Our economy in a structure is experiencing structural decline since 2000. And I think we need to urgently rethink the industrial strategy that we have to embark on to actually see how we can reverse this trend. Financial sector development could be an important angle that we need to look at when it comes to this. So it shouldn't be looked at separately, and especially on how we can actually reduce the financial constraints that firms could be facing when they want to internationalize or want to adopt more innovative kind of activities. Yeah, so that's all from me. Thank you.
So before I open the floor for questions, maybe I'll just ask a very quick question to Dr. Shankaran and also Alan on this. I think both speakers highlighted, about Malaysia's challenges for the manufacturing sector going forward, and the need to drive services sector and to compensate for maybe the lack of contribution from the manufacturing sector. So we know that the government's or Ministry of Finance will be announcing the 2020 budget on 11 October this year. So if both of you are being asked to give some suggestion to the finance minister, especially when going into 2020, it will be a challenging year for the global economy and also the domestic economy. What are some of the strategy that you would recommend? Not the long-term strategy, but short-term strategy that would help sustain Malaysia economy in view of the uncertainty in the global economy?
So hypothetically, right? So the ministry is going around asking for focus group discussion on the budget already. So anyway, I think in terms of, I think we need to distinguish between the role of the Ministry of Finance and also the other agencies that the government has, right? So we have MEA, and I understand that there will also be EPU under MEA now. There's also MITI, right? So they are all play different role. And then MITI is coming out with the industrial master plan, which the next industrial master plan, which I think ties in more closely to the issue that we are discussing now. But for the Ministry of Finance, when it comes to just fiscal policy per se for next year, I think one of the key areas to look at is contextualizing it to what we are discussing today. Two things. One is the fact that the risk of a global recession is very material. It's not something that we can ignore. And I think we need to look at what we can do to soften the blow or to offset some of the potential drag that we could be facing next year. I think a lot of the downside risks that we anticipated at the beginning of late last year and beginning of this year are no longer downside risks. They are actual baseline now, right? So I think that's one. And the second point is actually when it comes to incentive for fiscal incentive for investment and manufacturing. I think the point brought up by Dr. Shankar is very real, right? We actually provide a lot of fiscal incentive for investment, and in fact we have 32 agencies that is in charge of overseeing some part of fiscal incentive for investments, and there are more than 100 type of different activities that are being promoted by the government under MITI and outside MITI as well. So I think one of the key areas, and I think the government is looking at this, is actually to rationalize some of this. Is become quite unwieldy and might not be very effective in actually promoting the right kind of investment that we want. So I think these are the two areas. I think both areas are, I think, being looked at by the government now.
I think most of the things that I was talking about would be the kind of stuff that MEA and MITI would be interested in, and you have a slightly longer time frame to work on. As far as fiscal incentives are concerned, to repeat what I mentioned earlier on, I think we've sort of reached the edge and there's not a lot that can be done. But investors have a whole list of requirements that we don't seem to be able to fulfill yet. And I think it's those requirements, those expectations that we need to fulfill. I also think that the agencies, MATRADE, MIDA, they're doing about the best that they can. What we really need to do is, as Alan mentioned, we really need to look at the technology part of things, the creativity part, the innovation part of things. And that's where we seem to have been failing, tremendously, I think, over the past, 20, 30 years. And this, unfortunately, has to come after the knowledge-based master plan was launched, and that was, I think, I can't remember, but it was perhaps 15 years ago. So many of the problems that we're talking of now, talking of today, are problems that were identified 15, 20 years ago. We're still talking about the same problem, but not a great deal has been done on the ground. And I would really have a tough time telling the finance minister what to do, because this seems to be the wrong time to tell him you must give an incentive for the import of high-tech equipment. What could I constructively tell him? I'm not very sure, aside from telling him not to keep laboring the point that we are heavily indebted. I think we we accept that point. There are a set of things that can be done to handle the impending crisis that comes with the trade war and Trump's overall behavior. But I think the kind of things that I've been talking about are things that you have to attend to over a longer time period, 10 years, 20 years, and especially this question of education. Not a great deal has been done to reform, transform education in the country. So that you have a new government, you have Malaysia Baru, but there's not a great deal that's new to what has been done up to this point.
Okay. Thank you for accommodating the questions. Okay, right now what I'll do is I'll invite questions for the two speakers. Anyone has anything to raise, or comments, questions to Alan or Dr. Shankaran? the topic is really on industrialization, capital markets, and also economy. So it's quite a broad topics, and I'm sure there are issues or questions that you want the two speakers to address. Maybe I'll just invite one question, and then we'll close the session.
I saw the various presentations. So my question would be, so we have that manufacturing versus services, right, that we are looking at. Manufacturing form about 20% of the GDP. I'm not sure about services. And then the speaker mentioned about maybe we should look at services, right? And then we know that MITI has launched that the industry forward, talking about how you should in terms of digital technology, how that can enhance manufacturing. And then because of that, then we also need to look at the human resource part. So we are looking at Ministry of Human Resource, and then talking about human resource, then we also then need to look at the education system. So my question would be, who actually coordinate all that to make sure that people are talking to each other in order to make sure that we can achieve we have this strategy, and then we can achieve that strategy. Thank you.
Very convenient for him to pass the mic at this point. I think the person who should be coordinating is Tun Mahathir. Don't ask me the next question, which is he doing it? And what I find unpleasantly absent is the lack of political will to push any real reform ahead. I hope that no press here. But I think a lot of changes really do need political will. If you looked at the, I think there was a review of the 11th Malaysia plan, right? And I was disappointed. There wasn't a great deal that was under Malaysia Baru in this review, which was very different from any other review. It had the same statements. The only new statement or the only new term there was, I think, institutions. We need to have the right institutions or something. That was sprinkled in a couple of places. But aside from that, there wasn't a lot. But then I suppose MEA could be forgiven for that because they were reviewing something that was done by the previous Prime Minister. He hadn't done anything new, so there was nothing new to report. But at least the first steps could have been laid there. They weren't. Hopefully there would be something radical. There would be a radical break with IMP4 and 12th Malaysia Plan.
I think well, on who should be coordinating, I'm not going to answer directly, but given my position, so I think I just want to address two points. I think the question of services or manufacturing is an important one to understand better. I actually am agnostic to this point. I think traditionally, in the way we understand why services might not be, at least the traditional services might not be the most ideal sector to target, is because it relies primarily on domestic demand, and it doesn't. You either have high productivity, low capacity to absorb labor, i.e., employ a lot of people, or you have low productivity and a lot of employment, right? This doesn't apply to export manufacturing for a very simple reason, because you don't export for domestic demand, you export for external demand. So you get scale, you get high productivity, and you can actually generate a lot of jobs as well. So typically this was the older argument on why manufacturing matters a lot for development, when you move from low income to middle income to upper middle income and so on. But I think industries are changing very rapidly, right? So I think what is really important is whether services actually can generate whether you actually provide services for external demand rather than domestic demand. I think that's the real key discriminant here. Whether you are producing for the rest of the world or you're just producing for domestic demand. I think the sector that you should be promoting is actually a sector that would be producing for the external demand, because that would provide you with the scale, and secondly, potential competition that will actually drive up productivity, as well as potential for technological transfer. I think that is the key point, right? So previously there is a very clear-cut services, domestic. Manufacturing could be external because we can put things in a container and then ship it off. And with the current technology, I think services can be exported as well. So the question is, what kind of services can you embark on that we have comparative advantage in? And I think the second point on most of the literature that we know of when it comes to generating industrial development in the past from those successful East Asian countries is that we have one very powerful coordinating agency, or not just coordinating agency, just the most powerful agency, right? You have either your MTI or the Trade and Investment Ministry, which is for example, the case of Japan, their equivalent of MITI was actually more powerful than the Ministry of Finance, right? So same thing for most other countries, like in South Korea and so on. I think that provided a lot of focus, and as well as a lot of clarity on direction in which what kind of policy path the country is taking on. But of course, that's contingent on how well governed an economy is, right? So I think not trying to say that we should be emulating a super ministry within the country, but another point to highlight is that from that angle is that there's, even for the case of Korea less so, but especially Japan, since 1990s and year 2000 and so on and so forth, there is a financialization of our institutions, in the sense that most of the economic institutions, where most of the resources that goes into our public sector entities are actually in the financial sector side. Where we have central banks around the world getting most of for economic students, for example, or even for securities, capital market regulators, right? They are the one that getting bulk of the of resources and of economic students. So public sector economies in developing economies, the chances are not hired under the Ministry of Trade or Investment or Economic Planning Unit. They are hired in the central bank or the securities regulator or in the banks, right? So I think that itself provides, take away a lot of talent away from actually the industrial development side of the picture. And I think one way to reverse that is actually to definancialize the public sector in a way. Okay. My opinions are my own, not that of my employer or my past employers.
Okay. With that, we close this session. Please join me to show our appreciation to the two speakers.